tips for presenting and sharing your conversation design work, which we got a lot of feedback on because I think people need better context on how to make sure their work doesn't get stuck in projects and instead all the way into production, because that's why we're all here making better features for customers. If you don't know myself, my name is Sam. I'm on the Voiceflow team. I've been doing this expert conversation series for the pretty much all of 2022 now, which is cool, heading into the end of the year. And we're bringing experts to have conversations with us. And the expert today is Nicholas Laing from JPMorgan Chase. Nick, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate you taking time.
No, it's great to be here. I'm very excited for this workshop. I think we have a lot of good content to share with the whole team here. So I'm excited to get into it.
Awesome. Yeah, and speaking of good content, just a little bit of lay of the land so everyone knows where we're headed. We're going to do a little bit of career and background on Nick, just to set the stage, understand his team and org and general philosophy around how different roles work together. Then probably my favorite part is just 3 specific core questions you have to ask before you share anything. And then we're going to deep dive into each of those 3. And then lastly, do a demo and Q&A in Voiceflow and with Nick. So to get started, Nick, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself as a person and as a conversation designer?
Yeah, will do. So my name's Nick. I'm from New York, so born and raised. I've been here for my whole life. But yeah, I've been in conversation design for almost like 5 years now, maybe a little bit longer. And I recognize some of you, but for those of you who don't know me, I've been working at JPMorgan for over a year now. And before that, I had a conversation design role at Drift. And then before that, I was doing conversation design all over the place. It was freelance, some startups. I worked from like some grad students. Really, it was just trying to design anytime I got the chance to do it. So yeah, I started back in 2017 on Dialogflow, back when Dialogflow ES was like the only option. For those of you who might have been around then, that interface wasn't the greatest. So we've come a long way to tools like Voiceflow now, which are like very great for visual flow designers. So the game has changed a lot over the past even 5 years. So very curious to see where things are going to end up. But yeah, now I'm working at Chase and enjoying it. And then, yeah, I just wanted to give a little disclaimer here before we jump into things. I am still learning how to design conversations along with the rest of the industry. So like what we're going to talk about today, I don't think is the final word, so to say. I think we all have something to learn. So I'm looking forward to that Q&A section at the end, because this is what I've learned from my experience. But I'd be very curious to hear what others have to think about the process as well from their experience, and we can all learn together.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. So let's set the stage, as we do in most of our conversations, about your organization, or generally how you see the role of conversation design playing alongside different stakeholders, because that's really what we're talking about. If you're sharing something, you're sharing it with someone else, and those would be the stakeholders.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of core to the conversation that we're going to have here. So the way Chase is kind of structured is, I think it's more of a typical corporate structure, where there's a whole bunch of different teams. So there's some laid out here on the right side of your screen. Like, I remember just kind of taking a couple minutes to talk about some of the groups I work with, but I'm sure there's more. Product is one of the bigger ones. There's data science, there's research teams. I work with other UI designers and other conversation designers as well. So as we get into the conversation, we'll kind of talk about how these relationships work, but I think it's good to just reflect on your org and think about who are the different partners that you work with as designers, because each of those groups have different needs, as we'll kind of get into.
Yeah, we'll see this graphic a couple of times as we go. But I think one of the things we put down on paper really was, why are we having this conversation, right? And it's because we see some bad practices that lead to projects never making it into production, right? And yeah, we just jotted down 4, although we joked this could be its own like don't do workshop, which we didn't want to have. But let's just rip through some of these like bad practices that I think everyone knows. It was just, we're pretty limited in terms of workflow previous to what we're going to share today.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So yeah, just starting at the top here, highly technical assets for non-technical players. This is just one piece of the puzzle. So it's kind of just what assets are you sharing with your team and is it relevant to them? For instance, it might not be the best idea to get into the details about your logic or your API block to a UI designer because that's not something that really interfaces with what they do day to day. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
And yeah, I also wrote this where I think there's this habit as a designer when you make something awesome to share everything to everyone all the time, right? And I think it's this idea of like, oh, hey, here's a link to my project. Oh, hey, here's the prototype. And there's no context, especially earlier in the design process. And that leaves people a little bit overwhelmed and a little bit stuck because everyone's just looking at everything all at one time.
Right. Yeah. So there's definitely something to be said there about targeting what you share to your specific stakeholder. And then the next thing we have here, using static steps to share ask like with development. So the idea here is just that there are some things that in your projects might be a little bit more dynamic, and you want your prototype to reflect that. So it's like, how can we use these tools like Voiceflow to share what's actually being dynamically filled?
Yeah, and I think all these roll up to, I think both of our favorite one is just the idea of when you don't show a high fidelity or you don't show the full experience end to end, you're just leaving the assistant to imagination, which oftentimes that's where the assistant will stay, just in people's imagination, never in your chat, never in your IVR.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, like, there you have the capability of making high fidelity prototypes, and there's a lot of value to doing that. So if you have that luxury, definitely take advantage. The less you leave to people's imagination, the more you can be on the same page.
Love it. So then how do we do that, right? Let's stop talking about what not to do and let's talk about what to do with what we had time we have here. I think you did really well in our prep of just talking about, okay, there's 3 questions. Let's keep it super simple. Let's merry-go around those 3 questions and then dive into each.
Yeah, sounds good to me. So I think to start here, this first question is almost a given, but when I think about sharing designs out to other people on my team, one of the first primary questions will be, who are you sharing this prototype with and why? And there's a whole bunch of reasoning why this is one of the first questions you should ask. But primarily, you really just want to know what your stakeholder is interested in. Like prototypes can have so much detail, so it's very tactical to target your conversations and like the prototype you're demoing to the specific audience member. So then the next question here is, what is the right asset? So these kind of go hand in hand. But again, once you figure out who your audience member is, the next question you should ask is, what assets am I sharing with that audience member? So this is kind of like what we were talking about before, but you want to make sure that what you're sharing is actually relevant to that party. So again, for instance, like sharing technical information to your visual UI partner might not be the best or most relevant thing to them. Instead, you might want to focus on visual components and share that specifically with the partner. Just target your conversations. And then the last thing we have here is when in the workflow. So I like to think about this as the status of your prototype. So really, we're talking about the timeline here. Like, is this an early prototype where you just got this feature that you need to design and you're ideating, or is this like a mature prototype that's been refined and shared with the rest of the team multiple times, and now you want to have like a design review? Knowing where you are in that timeline is very important when you think about sharing your prototypes with the team.
Yeah, and speaking of that timeline, I think it makes the most sense. Let's talk about your unique structure. I think at Chase that you talk about is kind of this timeline that has 3 distinct steps, and I think it works really well. But I would love for you to kind of give context to other teams on how that's set up.
Yeah, so I think every company is different, but when we're talking about the lifespan of the design, normally this is almost like a circular process. So you might start with the feature, you develop it, you put it out into production, and then you see how it performs and kind of loop back and then question, like, how can this be better? you continue ideating, you put that in production, then you loop back around. But in this example, we're just really focusing on the lifespan of one feature from initial ideation to production. Like ideally, we would like this to loop, but we just really wanted to focus the conversation on the development of one feature end to end. So that being said, it really starts with this ideation step where you get the feature, and might be one of the most exciting times to be a designer, where you're given specs and say run, and you kind of like start thinking about different turns you might have, or different logic you might include, or different visuals that might be needed. That's what happens in this first step, leading up to like maybe a team review, where you have maybe a couple working prototypes or a general concept that you want to work with, and then you're sharing that with your team to get initial feedback. And yeah, that then ties into this middle phase, which we were calling the micro design review. The idea here is that after you've got this initial prototype where you kind of cover your bases and have some sense of direction, now you're starting to pull in other members of the team to say, all right, UI, like I'm thinking of building this component, like, what do you think? Or how do you think we should build this? Or if it's talking to data science to say like, hey, like, I think we might need to capture these entities. Like, let's start talking about how we can do that in this conversation. And there's a whole bunch of different groups that you're going to want to bring into this step. So it's just, again, a good idea to know who you're working with and what they want to see at this phase. And then finally, we end it with the design review. So the idea here is that you've worked through your design, you've ideated, you've collaborated with other members of the team, and now you have something that you feel comfortable calling your final product. So this is that final design review to say, hey, like we've coordinated, we built this thing, it works, and now you want to share that with the broader team to showcase what you've been working on. So this is kind of just a general idea of the timeline that we're working on.
Yeah, and every org might be a little bit different, but in reality, I think we're starting to see some best practices of bringing these other teams in as early, as close to ideation as possible, so that there's more time before that design review, so that you can get everyone's inputs into the framework that you create. We then kind of started to layer a little bit off-centered on purpose the different stages, right? Early iteration, more complete, and then truly complete, right? As far as the maturation of the design you're sharing, just for context here.
Right.
Awesome. So then let's talk. We start to mention different roles here, right? So we understand the timeline about the when and the workflow, but then we need to look at the roles that you're actually talking to. And we could go through all of these, and after the fact, I'm going to share your notes for every role that you provided. So thanks for doing that. I'm going to share that in the email and as a resource after the fact. But I think for here, let's just look at 4 that most teams interact with, right? Starting with product. You want to give us kind of the quick look at what product's looking for when you're sharing information with them?
Yeah. So I think product is a good group to start with. So again, every org is different, but at Chase, product is kind of like the overseer of the future. So product is coordinating with pretty much everyone else on the team, including design. So when I think about the core focus of product, they're really looking at the journey of the flow. They want to know everything that happens at each step and who needs to be pulled in where. So I just had like a couple examples of things that a product team member might be interested in. Like they might want to see the logic, they might have their eyes on the content, or any components, visuals that you have as part of this flow, as well as ideation and of course the general flow itself. So I see product as kind of this overseer of almost everything that you do as a designer, but there's still some degree of focus when you're having conversations with them. The next group is conversation design. So I know some people work alone, but for those of you who are lucky enough to have some design partners, I think it's super important that you share your design with other conversation designers. Like no person is an island, so you might have missed something that another designer could have seen and vice versa. So it's very good to get that feedback going, especially somebody who has the same skills or similar skills as you. So again, core focus here, similar to product, I think is very broad. So here we say design. So just be ready to share like why you did something and explain any design decision you made at a certain step, like, maybe why is one flow connected to another one, or like, why do you jump to a certain intent, or, why did you include logic in this step? Why didn't you just step right through? Those are a lot of questions that other conversation designers can entertain and understand, unlike other product groups, or just other groups in general. So next we have tech and dev. So when I work with my tech partners, the focus is really just the logic. And when I think about how I want to coordinate with them effectively, there's a lot of things that you can do, especially within the Voiceflow canvas, to make it very clear as far as what they should be focusing on and what's most relevant to them. So for instance, one thing that we've learned to do here at Chase is use color coordination to make the flow readable. So anytime we have logic in our flow, I think it's orange. And that's just an indicator to dev to say, all right, look here because there's something going on under the hood that you might want to be familiar with. So it's just using tools like that to be clear with the team to say, this is what you should be looking at. And then we can kind of, again, have that discussion, that dialogue. And then, yeah, there's other things that dev might be interested in sometimes. Sometimes it's visual components, or maybe dev has questions about content. Just be ready to answer those. And depending on the team, the NLU might also be a whole nother conversation worth having with dev. And then the last group that we have here is research. This is one of my personal favorite groups to work with for whatever reason. Researchers tend to be very customer focused. So whenever you're sharing a prototype with them, they're putting themselves in the shoes of the customer and trying to figure out, okay, are there any like holes here? Does this not make sense to a customer point of view? Especially when you're looking at research questions, because if the research question misaligns with the user experience, obviously the data you're going to get back won't be as valuable. So when you're working with research partners, you really want to focus on just like the quality of the prototype, I would say. So it's about the visuals, like what buttons are they clicking? Is it clear what happens next in each step? Sometimes when you're working with research as well, they want to see the different ideations, especially if you're doing an A/B test, for instance, they want to see why one version is different from another. And you can kind of speak towards them and explain, okay, in version A, we did this because XYZ, and B, we did this because XYZ. You got to make sure that's clear to them. And then one pro tip we have here is to use the branding options when you're sharing your prototypes with research. Again, this is that whole idea that when you're testing something with research candidates, that you want your prototype to be as authentic and mirror the experience as close as possible. And Voiceflow has tools that allow us to do that. So whether it's just coloring or using your brand logo in the chat, all of these things just add like that much more detail that make the user experience from the research candidate perspective just that much more accurate.
And I think we're going to show the research user testing part in like the ideation to that micro design stage in Voiceflow in a second here, because I think you do really well about like, if you can zero in and already build out pre-flows that you want tested, it makes that process that much more valuable for both teams, right? And I think you'll see that across the board. Yeah, before we hop in, we also then took that same timeline, right, and started to layer each of these roles. Again, to your point, this is not the ideal cyclical workflow. Obviously, product comes in a lot earlier, but in terms of seeing a design, this kind of waterfall approach is what you've seen, right?
Yeah. So the way I like to think about it is when I first get handed a feature, normally me as a designer, I like to just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. So good ideas, bad ideas, I put them on the canvas just so it's there. And then I start to kind of organize things into some sort of order that says, all right, these are some potential prototypes. These are ones that we can just toss. And then you kind of pull in your design team and say, all right, can you take a look at this? Like, does this make sense? And then once you're kind of zeroed in or like approaching a technique that you want to use for the flow, that's when you can start pulling in other partners, such as product or tech. And then they can start looking at things and kind of really ironing out what that experience could look like until you get to that final design review. And yeah, research also comes in later in that process once the prototype is just a little bit more refined.
Great. So I think this last section of like your 3 questions, we can fly by a little bit because we're about to show it in Voiceflow. But I think it is useful to then again start to kind of bucket the different tools along the same timeline, going from very early stage to obviously very high fidelity.
Right. Yeah. So here you can kind of see on the timeline what assets might be most pertinent depending on where you are in this design process. So yeah, there's a couple ideas when you're in this early like ideation iteration phase where you might want to like write on the canvas and like show interact with your team there, or just kind of like how I was talking about where I just brain dump onto the canvas and share my ideas that way. That's another idea where you can share those like those thoughts with your team in this early phase. Also, like I like the one-on-one conversations here, kind of speaking towards that before, where I think it's very powerful when you're talking to other designers in this early phase to really iron out the experience from the start. And then, yeah, once we get to this middle phase, there's a whole bunch of other tools that come into play. So like maybe in this early phase, you might lay out your logic, but in this middle phase, you can actually fill it out and connect APIs and like lay out your conditions and your variables. Maybe in this phase, you want to create some personas so your flow is actually testable from end to end. Or yeah, do user testing and like take advantage of the transcripts and leave comments there and tag your teammates. That's kind of what happens in this middle phase where you're really working on that experience to get it to that final prototype, which in the end, we want to really showcase the experience itself and not the canvas. So one point of emphasis I would like to put on is that when you're sharing your polished design, you probably shouldn't be in the canvas view. Instead, you want to have like a shareable prototype or the new web chat feature where now you can literally simulate what the conversation might look like for the user and then demo that for your broader team. Because what you're showcasing is the design, not the canvas.
Yeah, that's a powerful last line there, I think, Nick, because even for the most technical stakeholders that have been in the canvas for 3/4 of this process, to then go back into the canvas at that final prototype, it distracts, right? Because all that work is already rolled up into the final high fidelity experience. So I think that's a great summary. I also want to call this out here with the little bit of the kind of assets dump of things that you just mentioned, right? Going from left to right, anywhere from kind of just random notes to myself, right? That you might leave on the canvas, all the way to the transcripts in the middle, API blocks, the NLU model, and then all the way to canvas prototyping and high fidelity prototyping. Would you say, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but like you've used some sort of combination of these when presenting your work back to the model we just shared?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like I think it all depends on the project and the team that you're working on, but in some combination, like these set of tools and like that development pattern is very useful.
Great. Awesome. So we're at about the half-hour mark here. So we're about to hop into the demo. I want to give a quick 10,000 foot view about what you're about to see here, just so there's not a complete misunderstanding about what feature we're building. So Nick and I are kind of going to demo as if we're working for Voiceflow banking company. The feature specifically, not an entire assistant. So it's a feature build of thinking about the returning user flow, and the intents and the topics related would be like transfer money, check and balance. And then I think the big thing here, Nick, if you just want to reiterate while I flip over to the canvas, is just those 3 stages that people are going to be seeing here, from ideation, team review, and then design review as I flip over. Let's dive right into ideation, and a lot going on here. So can you kind of take us through, maybe as I see you're on canvas too here, can you kind of take us through why we might see 3 different returning user flows off the top, a little bit messy, a little bit kind of info dump as you talked about?
Yeah. So the idea here is just to kind of showcase, the chaos of a designer's mind and say, okay, like I've been thinking about this feature, here are 3 different potential versions of what we could put into production. So for instance, like this first welcome block has an image, and then the content is maybe a little bit more agnostic. It doesn't, the persona doesn't have a name. And then in the second version, maybe we're thinking about saying, you know what, maybe we can name our assistant Bob, and this is Voiceflow Bank, and also include the image here. Or maybe there's an idea where we just don't even include the image and just get right into it. So there might be different pros and cons for using each approach. And this is kind of that step where you would put your ideas on the canvas and then share with your team, and like maybe put them, like tag them in a comment and say, you know, like, Sam, what do you think is the best version here? Like, do you think we need an image or maybe not? And then you just start getting that initial feedback.
Yeah, and I like the most too this idea of kind of notes to yourself that we had talked about, right? Where maybe you're not even tagging external teams just yet. You're just leaving things for yourself or your other CXD partners to kind of jam on, right? In this very early stage.
Yeah, so like an example for this might be if you want to color coordinate things, and yeah, here's a note to myself to say like, yeah, maybe I can consider using different colors for the block. So while I haven't gotten quite to that step, this is just another part of that idea dumping where I'm just getting all my thoughts out onto the canvas and sharing what I have here.
I also want to call out too where, obviously our best practice is using topics to organize key intents, nested intents that we want to hit throughout an experience. Here you can see that we have like just pills for the intents, which obviously is not best practice, but this is kind of you just dumping the intents, and maybe you built out the check balance one, but transfer money, you're like, okay, I'm not even building it out yet. I just know that I need these two based on the features that I've feature requests and the intents from the brief.
Right. Yeah. So again, the idea is just get your thoughts out. If transfer money is on your mind, even if it's not built out yet, this is just another way to allow you as a designer to indicate what you might want to work on next, or just what you have in mind at this point in the build.
I also want to click into the check balance flow. So for example, you might have built a very basic, block here of, okay, let me check that for you. Here you go. You have an image placeholder. And here I left like a comment for myself, could we make this card personalized to the first name, right? So like you haven't done any work except for maybe building out the variable here because you want it to exist as in the first underscore name, but no one has obviously come in on UI yet. Maybe CXD has said, that's a great idea. And you're going back and forth, Nick and myself go back and forth in the thread, but maybe it's just Sam designing for Sam at this point, right? All of those kind of that brain dump can be whatever you need it to be on canvas here.
Right, exactly.
Great. Let me go back to the home. Yeah, and I think we hit on all that. We even talked on the APIs, really just the block, but obviously no work done in that actual API request yet.
Yeah, and then one other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea for inspiration as well. I think this is a great point in the design process to, if you're referencing some other flow, or if you've seen another bot that has cool behavior that you think might be useful for you, this is also a good step to just throw in links or images of that, whatever inspires you. And you can use that to, again, share with your team, or also just have it as a reference for yourself as you're building out this flow.
Yeah, awesome. Great. So now we've done ideation, you worked with your team. Now let's take a look at what that mid design review might look like when it comes to specific teams, right? So obviously the same project, just a little different. What are some of the core things that after the design work has been done that now we're looking at when it comes to sharing your design work here, Nick?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we could talk about. Some of the bigger ones we have highlighted here. So for instance, maybe we talked about that image, we decided we want to use it. Now that we have sort of ironed this experience out a little bit more, so there's not 3 versions, but there's one flow, we might say, okay, at this point, we've decided we want to use an image. So now is the time to maybe coordinate with UI and say, hey, can we get some like specs for this image we're thinking about having? Maybe your chat is refined to a certain size, and you just want to start having those conversations and figure out what constraints you have and coordinate with your team to get things built. So this is an example of, one partner that you might have during this this middle phase. Yeah, another one is like your data needs. So if for whatever reason that you're calling to an API, but in this phase, we have an idea of what we want to pull from the API. So here we have a little note that says, all right, I want to make sure that I can get the account number and the name and the balance from our customers during this step. But you can still see that the API block is empty. So idea here being, now that we've, again, refined the flow and defined what we need in this little block here, the idea is to have that targeted conversation with our team and say, all right, let's, can we have these, is it possible for me to make the request for this information? And just really start talking about feasibility and how you can actually implement it into your prototype and eventually the final product.
And one thing I want to call out here is, I think everyone's best case scenario would be, hey, work with dev and we're actually pulling on production level data, right? Like, oh, we're pinging the user database to pull, Sam Burns's account number, right? But oftentimes in these early phases, you might instead work to just create an Airtable or a sandbox level database that you can also use as an API that mirrors all the same account information you would find in production, that allows you to actually get high fidelity, truly immersive, sample names, account numbers, balances, but yet run prototypes and user tests that look and feel as if they're in-app or IVR, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's a great call out, Sam. And one other thing I wanted to flag here, another pro tip, so to say, is you can, if you're trying to share information with your team, you might just want to comment here on this block to say, hey, data science, like, can you take a look at this API? But another thing you could do is select the box or the block and share the link from there. So that's just another way you can, when we're talking about targeting the conversation, this is another way to indicate, like, you don't need to look at this whole project. Like, you don't have to look at the different topics that we have here. I'm just sending you a link to this specific block to get your feedback here. So it's, again, just another way to target that conversation and to get the information that you need from that specific stakeholder.
Great. And then I also wanted to call out on the check balance flow here. We had built an A/B test, which you had brought up earlier.
Right. Yeah. So idea here is that, maybe you're working through the flow. At some point, you and the design team aren't settled on an approach. So maybe you want to include a visual component, or maybe you just want to have it text-based. This is a point where you can coordinate with your research partners and again say, all right, like, we're just looking here at this check balance topic. And you start having that conversation with your researchers to say, how could we A/B test this? Like, does this make sense? Like, will this help answer our research interest? And you really start having that customer-centric conversation about the different ways you can take the prototype and how you can test it.
And I love, even we had talked about using just like markup, for example, just to come in here and go back and forth about like initial findings, right? Like,
yes,
image versus no image, just to set that source of truth for when you're going back and forth. We've also seen teams come in and use this random block, and then, for example, say, okay, great, this is going to be, we're just going to set, image, create a variable that's image to yes, and then we add it, right? So then we can say, and we could map that API data and run a bunch of user tests on moderated user tests to see how many people run through image and how people don't, and if the conversation was a success or not, right? So that's one very iterative way that we've seen people kind of quickly in that team review time, make some meaningful impact.
Yeah, that's a really cool way to use the tool. That's actually a great idea.
Good, you can take that. I don't know if we can
yeah,
but yeah, we've seen teams do that. So go ahead. Yeah, so I think that's all the things we wanted to call out here. Obviously, in this transfer money flow a little bit more built out, we actually have the NLU model much more robust, which you would actually be able to collaborate, for example, with an NLU designer right in the NLU designer here. If you wanted to say, oh, well, we're missing intents, we're missing entities, we're missing some utterances that need to be added to this more immersive transfer money flow, you would do that at this stage too in like a working session.
Right.
Great. And then let's flip over to the last stage here, which is design review. Why don't you take us through what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so in this design review phase, we've refined the flow. So the idea here is at this point, there's no more version A, version B, there's no more brain dumps or empty API blocks. What you see here is refined. So now we have decided on what our visual looks like, and we have that in the actual canvas. We have the API block connected to an Airtable database. So now we can actually pull dynamic information from the database. So yeah, what you're seeing here is just that refined high fidelity prototype, which if we were testing, in this view here, and sharing this with the broader team, now like they're very well immersed where they can see our logo and they can see our brand colors. So this is just that idea of making a prototype that has high fidelity that you can share with your team and show that, hey, like, yep, it pulls in your name and it can pull in any visual component and display your balance. So now we're showcasing the design, not the canvas that's on the design.
Yeah, and as you called out very well, it's at any of those questions you had with user testing or image work, now it's all baked. So you don't need to go back into Canvas at that design to everyone phase to say, oh, and by the way, the work we talked about, it's done. And here's how it looks on the canvas. Don't waste time doing that, right? Jump right into what's possible.
Exactly. Yeah, and then here you can also answer different questions that your team might have. So you can use a prototype in different ways. And it's not to say that you should not use the canvas when you're displaying your prototype at this design review phase. But the idea is that you really want to showcase how the prototype works from a user's point of view instead of from a designer's point of view or a technical point of view, explain how it works, because that's not where you are on the timeline anymore. It's more about how does it actually function.
One thing I will call out, hopping back into the canvas, is as you go to share, it is sometimes useful to create personas, even in that final design review, where, for example, in this scenario, if you had like a returning versus a new user flow, you could set that variable to, we are only going to look at the returning user, or we're only going to look at the new, or let's say this person is a silver rewards member versus a platinum or a diamond, right? Then you can set that persona. So again, you might not be showing every branch of the conversation, even in that final design review. You might only want to zero in on this specific type of user, this specific type of persona. So that's another powerful way to kind of iterate on your work and only share high fidelity, but within a specific context.
Yeah, I think that's great. And yeah, I really just like the idea of specific context, because then you can really focus on what aspects of the flow you plan to showcase. So maybe you updated a flow and you want to highlight the areas that you've changed from last year to this year. So instead of showing the overall flow, you can have a persona that showcases that new path, so to say. And again, like you can always leave it open for questions. So there's room for ambiguity there. So if someone has a question about how the flow used to function, then you can take a look in the canvas and show it. But for the sake of demo, it helps to show that customer-centric view.
Well, and I think you talk about like legitimizing the conversation design role. If you go in with like, hey, here's everything we did forever, let me justify my design decision from the past year, it kind of invalidates your no, I know this is right because I've done the workflow, I understand every step, and this is what we're presenting because I brought in all the stakeholders already. No, this is the final design review for a reason, not can you shoot holes in every piece of my canvas since last year, right? I think that's a big narrative flip in your mind as you go to share your work.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out, just to empower yourself as the subject matter expert in the conversation design role.
The last thing I'll call out here We here created a complete flow to actually grab information from Airtable, which you saw in the demo. I pulled Nick's name. I pulled a random account number to actually show. If you work with your dev team once to set up this API pull, and it's like a dynamic Airtable base, just going in and then selecting this to actually create a component, well, then you can create these templates and components in here to then reuse that same API call throughout every project, right? So every time you don't have to be like, oh, hey, like, can we create a new database? Well, no, like your user data is not shifting that much for the in-app assistant, right? So realistically, if you can create that 10-column user data sandbox, then just use that template over and over between projects, and then you're always operating on the most recent close to production sandbox data that there is.
Yeah, that's another great feature. Just anything that allows you to recycle components and information that you've done before makes your job that much more streamlined. So that's another good call out.
Well, great. I think, Nick, we ran through kind of your tips, and then we ran through what it could look like in Voiceflow. We're coming up on about 15 minutes at the most left. I know we got some people on camera, some people on the chat, but would love to open it up for questions now. I'll stay in the tool, or we can obviously flip back to the deck if there are specific questions. Yeah, I think this is a great time to kind of go back if anyone has any specific thoughts on the workflow itself, how Nick would attack a specific part of the workflow. This is a great chance to ask him in the chat or pop on audio and drop the question in real time.
Yeah, I'm also very curious to see how things work at other organizations. So if you found any best practices that work for you and your team, or if you're curious about how I derived my best practices, yeah, I'd be happy to hear those questions.
Hey, I can jump in with a question.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, I think one of the assumptions of what I've seen today is that there will be a number of people who are in the Voiceflow project who will be have shared access to the project. One of the things that I'm struggling with is that we do a lot of work in Jira. And so you have to document things externally and have them kind of attached to a ticket, or there are people who you probably are never going to get into Voiceflow for a variety of reasons. Are there strategies you have to mitigate that concern?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something that we're navigating through right now. So I can kind of give you some tips that have worked for us currently. But again, like I said earlier in the conversation, we're still learning. So I think I still have yet to figure out the best way to do this. But in terms of having people collaborate either on the canvas or use the canvas, there's a couple different strategies that come to mind. One is like in our Jira tickets, we actually have started to attach images of the canvas. So in Voiceflow, you can actually export like the entire canvas view as I think it's a PNG. And then we put that in our Jira tickets. So that kind of reflects the old way we used to work, where we had these static images of the flow. So to me, that's kind of like this middle area where we say, all right, we started to build our flows in Voiceflow, and here's like that static image that you might be used to, but we also would include the link to Voiceflow in our Jira ticket to say, if you want to look in more specifically, you can do that. But perhaps probably the best piece of advice I could give is to really have conversations with different people on your team who are either struggling to use the tool, who like might not have access, or they don't know how it works. In order to migrate over to Voiceflow, I think as designers, we know that the tool is very powerful and can help us streamline our work, but a lot of times it's not immediately obvious to other people on your team. So with that said, like I've had conversations with different people on my dev team to say, just to have that one-on-one if they're confused and say like, I don't know how this works, or like, I can't even get into the canvas. Like, let's jump on a Zoom call and like figure it out. So it's kind of like those baby steps where it's going to be a little bit painful and annoying to kind of repeat how everything works and say, break it down to the basics. But I think once you get people in the tool and just to realize how powerful it could be for their specific role, it's just going to be a matter of like slowly grinding over time to get everybody on.
Yeah, that's a good call. I think you're right. It does feel like doing that bit of like ambassadorship will help things in the long run, but it may kind of sting in the short term. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, Brian, and very, very tactically too, just like hyperlinking the Jira ticket in comments or in like in Canvas markup and inviting those stakeholders as viewers or collaborators is a great way to like, at this point, this is the part of the Jira ticket that I'm referencing, or using Canvas markup to be like, hey, this is the feature, here's the Jira ticket, and kind of creating a template for that top left corner I've seen you be very valuable. And then it's like, hey, it's non-negotiable. Here's the Jira ticket, here's the topic I'm running, and here we go, right?
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. One question we had here was when it comes to product owners, because I think that's like a very vast category in different stages of the workflow. Do you always lead with Canvas, always lead with prototype when you're chatting with product managers, product owners, or does it depend on the part of the workflow?
Yeah, so I would say I don't always use the Canvas. I think working with product is one of them. That's like the stakeholder group that has the most diverse interest. So yeah, like I kind of said it before earlier, sometimes I'm going to be talking about logic with product. Sometimes we're going to be talking about visuals. Sometimes it's the specific content. So when it comes to how I share, again, it's like that what in the conversations, like what are we actually looking about? So if someone pinged me from my product team and they're like, hey, like the content on this flow doesn't seem right, then we can like jump into that specifics block and say, all right, like what seems to be the issue here? Or if product is reaching out to me and says like I'm not too sure if this visual is going to work, or it doesn't seem to fit, then maybe we can look at that view in the full like prototype view, and just from the customer's perspective, really nitpick and say, all right, if this is what it looks like, would there be a problem if we included a button here? Or like, is this component too big? So again, it's very dependent on context. So once you think about what the context of that conversation is, then you can kind of use that to figure out and determine what view is most appropriate for that conversation.
Got it. Kind of using that chart we had talked about, like, okay, it's this stage, this role, this asset, right? And being repeatable on that. Had a question about working with UI or graphic design or product design in that capacity. We had talked a little bit about images. For example, if a UI designer is working in a graphic design tool, for example, but yet you're sharing specs. Someone was wondering, like, how do you present those alongside when it comes to sharing your work? I mean, I know we had a little bit talked about using those image blocks and the specs and putting them right into the prototype. Is that how you work sometimes?
Yeah, so again, this is something we're still figuring out at Chase, but one thing that we've kind of determined is Figma is part of our tool suite. So, and we use it for that visual focus. So we like to have like the red lines and like the pixel counts, stuff like that is very useful for developers who are building out these components. So we kind of went back and forth in terms of like, maybe we could just put the image in Voiceflow, or we could like write the specs on the side. But ultimately where we've landed so far is to actually use like text and comment a link to the Figma where you see the full specs. So Voiceflow might have a copy of that image where you can see it in the context of the flow. But if you want to share that with your UI developer, you can just provide an easy link on the canvas to where that fully spec'd out version of the component might be. So again, we're still kind of learning and playing around with different processes, but that's kind of where we've landed. And of course, it depends on like what tools you use at your organization, but so far that seems to be working for us.
And I think this is where versioning comes in play a lot too, just to respect and make sure that the UI's designer's work is most up to date. That if you do a new version and a new graphic is ready from the UI team, that the version represents a new graphic. It's not that static old image, right? You want to make sure that it's constantly updated and accurate in the prototype as you work with those teams as well. So using versioning within Voiceflow is important.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. It's a good point.
Adrian had a good question as we wrap up here. how do you go about sharing different prototypes by using the personas feature to use the flows for separate user types? For example, logged in or not. Here we had like returning versus new user. Do you have any thoughts on that, Nick?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I can think about where we use personas for like internal tests or for research. And I think it again depends on the partner. So I kind of feel like I'm repeating myself, but that's kind of, I guess, the core of this conversation. So for instance, when we use personas for user research, we had to speak with our researchers so that they understood how personas work and set up different ways that the flow might be able to go. So if we're testing, two different images, and we're not A/B testing, but we want to control like how many people see this version and that version or whatever it might be. It's a matter of setting up those personas and then having the researcher know that they can go and change the variable state of the prototype so that they can switch over to whatever alternative version you might be sharing. Internally, it kind of depends too, like on who's conducting the prototype or the demo. Like sometimes we'll just have a static persona and say, if you want to test this flow, we're going to choose the best path that works that covers mostly everything, and just have that link and send it out. So that way, whoever wants to test the prototype has some kind of path ironed out, but you still give them some flexibility in terms of which path they go down. So those are two different ideas of how you might want to use personas in this use case. But yeah, they're very flexible. So
yeah, and I'll also add on to that I've seen personas work really well in like the moderated environment when you set multiple variables. So like finding someone in a 10-person moderated environment that is like the right age, zip code, balance, user, longevity, all the things that you're using in the experience, and then doing a moderated test one-on-one with that person using the persona. Whereas what Nick's talking about too, when you start to go at like A/B test or like this or that, the unmoderated works really well to randomize or set a general persona amongst two separate, N50 audiences, and then sending those out and seeing how transcripts perform. So really, I think personas, like you say, Nick, are flexible, but work really well when you're going down the moderator route too.
yeah, totally agree.
Great. Those are some great questions. So thank you all for dropping them and keeping the conversation going. I think, we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'll say a big thanks to you, Nick. That was fantastic and really delivered on actually giving tactics. So thank you for sharing your expertise today with us.
Yeah, I'm very glad you had me, honestly. Like, this was a great experience. And yeah, I'm happy to share more about how I'm learning to work in conversation design. And I really I think it's important that this is a conversation so that it goes both ways. As I expressed before, still learning how to use the tooling and like how this role will actually work. And I think most of us are too. So I think if you have any other thoughts, feel free to reach out and, we can start having this conversation and really define the standards of what it means to be in conversation design.
Spot on. I love that. I will send out a recap email to everyone who signed up with a recording to this, Nick's contact info as he opened up the floodgates to collaborate and bounce ideas off one another. So take a look out for that. I also want to tease that in 2 weeks and 2 days, so Thursday, December 1st, we're going to do our next expert conversations, the last one of the calendar year, with Simon Wolf from PayPal, as well as his customer support agent counterpart. They're working together to actually analyze what happens after agent handoff, which is kind of unique. And not a lot of times we talk about containment, but we talk about what are those qualitative misunderstandings that why is a customer going to an agent and what's happening after the fact. So they're going to share their step-by-step process for how they're collaborating and what results they've seen. So I'll also include a sign-up link for that in the email I send out after this workshop. So thank you all for being here. This was a blast, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next one. Thank you again, Nick.
Indeed. Thank you all.